My twin sister stole my entire identity, job, husband, and life while I was in the hospital. The call came at 11:14 on a Tuesday morning, and the woman on the other end of the line said 6 words that I will never, for as long as I live, unhear. She said, "Your husband wanted me to call you." I was standing in the parking lot of a Walgreens in Tucson, Arizona. I had a plastic bag in one hand and my phone in the other, and I was 37 years old, and it had been 4 months since I'd woken up from a medically induced coma. And I remember thinking very precisely in the half-second before I understood, that's strange because David doesn't know anyone in this area code. Then I understood. The woman's name was Linda Parfit. She was a county clerk in Asheville, North Carolina, which is where David and I had lived for 9 years. She was calling because a marriage license application had just come across her desk, and when she'd run the routine identity verification on the bride's name and social security number, the system had returned an anomaly. The number was already associated with an active marriage record in the same county. Not a duplicate application, an existing marriage. David Harmon applying to marry Rebecca Callahan, when Rebecca Callahan was, according to county records, already married to David Harmon. She thought she wasn't sure, she said, and she was sorry if she was wrong, but she thought someone ought to know. The bride's name on the application was Rebecca Callahan. My name is Rebecca Callahan. And I was 4 states away, alone, and my husband had apparently just applied for a marriage license with someone who had my name. That someone was my twin sister, Claire. Before I go any further, I want to say something to you directly. I know how this sounds. I know that what I just described sounds like the premise of a movie, the kind of thing that happens to characters, and not to real people in parking lots holding plastic bags. I have spent 2 years sitting with the strangeness of it, and it still sounds like that to me sometimes. Like something that happened to someone else, in a story, in a genre where everything is slightly more dramatic than real life allows. It's not. Every word of it happened. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand not just what happened, but how something like this is actually possible, and what it requires of the people who do it, and what it costs the people it's done to. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It matters to me more than you know. And a note up front, some names and details have been altered to protect people who deserve protection in this story. There are some. The emotional core of everything I'm about to tell you is exactly as it happened. My name, my real name, the one I was born with and grew up with, and have spent my whole life answering to, is Rebecca Marie Callahan. I'm 39 years old. I'm a landscape architect, or I was before my life was disassembled and partially rebuilt, and is now something I'm still figuring out. I grew up in a small city in western North Carolina, went to NC State for architecture. Came back after graduation because the mountains had never let go of me, and built a career and a life and a marriage in Asheville, which is the kind of city that makes it easy to believe things will always be mostly good. I have a twin sister named Claire. We are not identical twins. We are fraternal, same womb, same birthday, December 14th, 39 years ago, but we look enough alike that people who didn't know us well sometimes mixed us up at a distance. Same general coloring, same height, similar bone structure. Closer than most sisters in appearance, further than most people imagine in every other way. We had been close once. When we were children, and then again in our mid-20s, and then we had a period of estrangement that began around the time I met David, and that I always explained to people by saying, we're just very different, in the mild way that implies something complicated without specifying what. And that was true, we are very different, but the estrangement had a more specific cause than mere personality difference, and that cause was David. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand the beginning before the middle makes sense. David Callahan, yes, same last name, no relation, the coincidence that we joked about for years, was not my first relationship, but he was my first serious one. We met when I was 28, at a party thrown by a mutual colleague, in a house with a deck that needed structural work, and that I could not stop thinking about while people talked around me. He had found me standing on the deck examining the joinery and said, "Is it going to collapse?" And I said, "Probably not tonight," and he laughed and we talked for 3 hours. David is, and I want to be fair here, because this story is not really about whether David is a good or bad person, though that's something I've thought about extensively. David is a charming man. He is the kind of charming that feels effortless, the kind that makes you feel, when it's directed at you, like you have been specifically recognized and found to be worth recognizing. He is funny and warm, and he remembers everything you tell him: your coffee order, the name of your childhood dog, the thing you mentioned once about your grandmother. He pays attention in a way that feels rare and specific and valuable. He is also, I came to understand slowly and then all at once, a man who has a particular need to be the most important person in any room, not the loudest, not the most dominant in obvious ways, but the gravitational center, the one everything orbits. For the first 3 years, I orbited happily. We got married in 2013. Small ceremony, mountain backdrop, the kind of wedding that looks effortless because two people spent 6 months making it look that way. My sister Claire was my maid of honor. She and David had met perhaps a dozen times by then, and were in the category I would have described, if asked, as friendly acquaintances. Warm but not close. The way your spouse's family friends are warm but not close, present at important occasions and pleasant at them. Looking back, I think I was wrong about what category they were in, but I didn't know what I was looking at. The first 3 years of the marriage were, with the usual allowances for the ordinary friction of two people sharing a life, genuinely good. David worked in hospitality management, a boutique hotel group in Asheville, where he was director of guest experience, which is the kind of job title that tells you a great deal about the person who thrives in it. He was good at it. He brought the same attentive warmth to his professional life that he brought to everything else, and he was promoted twice in 4 years, and we were comfortable. My landscape architecture practice grew. I hired 2 people. We bought a house with a yard I redesigned 3 times before I got it right. We talked about children without deciding. We went to Italy for our 4th anniversary and argued about whether to spend 2 extra days in Cinque Terre, and agreed to disagree and stayed 2 extra days, and they were perfect. Then, in our 9th year, 2 things happened. The first, Claire came back into my life. She had been living in Atlanta since her own divorce, 3 years earlier, from a man I had never particularly liked, and who turned out to deserve not to be liked. She called me in January and said she wanted to rebuild things between us, that she missed me, that the divorce had made her think about what actually mattered. I was cautious. Our estrangement had been real, and the reasons for it still felt present, but I was also, in the way of people who love someone they've been trying not to think about, immediately, dangerously glad to hear from her. We started talking again. Weekly calls, then more frequent. She visited in April. She and David were easy with each other, relaxed in a way that felt natural, the way people are when they genuinely like each other. I was glad. I had wanted them to like each other. The version of my life in which my husband and my sister were genuinely fond of each other was the version I wanted to be living. I was living it. I just didn't know what was underneath. The second thing that happened in our 9th year, I got sick. I want to tell you about the illness carefully, because it matters, not just as the mechanism through which everything else happened, but as its own thing, its own experience, something that changed me before the other things changed me. In September of that year, I started having headaches. Not ordinary headaches, I'd always been prone to those. These were different. These arrived like weather, sudden and overwhelming, with a specific quality of wrongness that I tried to describe to my doctor and couldn't quite capture. She sent me for imaging. The imaging found something. It was a cavernous malformation, a cluster of abnormal blood vessels in the brain, technically benign, present probably since birth, but now beginning to bleed. The bleeding was small and intermittent. The symptoms were the headaches, some cognitive fogginess I had attributed to overwork, one episode of weakness in my left hand that I had decided not to mention to anyone because I was 36 years old, and weakness in your hand was not something that happened to 36-year-olds. My neurosurgeon, a woman named Dr. Patricia Vega, who had the particular quality of delivering very bad news in a very calm voice, told me that the malformation needed to come out. That the surgery had a good success rate in the hands of an experienced team, that I was young and healthy and a good candidate, and that we should schedule it as soon as I was ready. I went home and told David, who took my hand and was steady and kind and said whatever you need, in the way he always said whatever you need, in the way that had always made me feel, when I heard it, like I was not alone. I was not alone, he was right about that, I just wasn't entirely right about who was with me. The surgery was in November, 3 days of preoperative preparation, 6 hours in the operating room, and then a gap, a nothing. A black space in my memory that is still black, that I can look at the edges of but cannot enter. The anesthesia, the procedure, and then a medically induced coma that lasted, according to the records I later requested and read very carefully, 11 days. 11 days. David was there. According to the nurses I later spoke to, he was at the hospital every day during those 11 days. Present, attentive, asking the right questions, holding my hand when I was unconscious in the way that you hold someone's hand when you believe they might be able to feel it. Claire was there too. She had driven up from Atlanta the day of the surgery, and according to those same nurses, had stayed for the first 4 days. Then she'd gone home, they said. She'd said she needed to get back to Atlanta. She did not go back to Atlanta. But I didn't know that yet. I woke up on day 12. I know this because they told me, and because there are medical records, but I have no experience of the preceding 11 days as time. It's not like sleep, which you at least know you've done. It's simply absence. The world stopped and then started again, and 11 days had happened without me. What I knew when I woke up, I was alive. My name was Rebecca Callahan. I was in a hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. I had brain surgery. I was married to a man named David. I had a twin sister named Claire. What I did not know, that while I had been in the absence, Claire had moved into my house. The recovery was long. The surgery had been successful in the technical sense. The malformation was gone, the bleeding had stopped. But there are no clean endings in neurosurgery, only new baselines, and my new baseline included fatigue that functioned like a physical weight, some difficulty with word retrieval under stress, and a specific kind of cognitive fragility that my medical team described as normal, expected, and manageable with time and rest. David visited every day during the inpatient phase, which lasted another week after I woke up. He was the same, warm, attentive, present. He held my hand. What I noticed, and filed away without examining closely because I was tired in ways I'd never been tired before, was a certain quality of carefulness in him. Not the carefulness of concern. A different carefulness. A careful watching. As though he was monitoring how much I could perceive. Claire called once during the inpatient week. A short call, maybe 7 minutes. She said all the right things. Her voice had the slightly elevated brightness of someone performing ease. I was medicated and exhausted, and I told myself she was nervous because her sister had nearly died. When I was discharged, David brought me home to the house on Ridgeview Court, where we had lived for 6 years, and Claire's car was not in the driveway. And there was no indication, none that I could see, that anything was different from how I had left it. It took me 3 more weeks to notice the small things, and another month after that to understand what the small things meant. If you're still with me, thank you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been surrounded by evidence of something wrong and couldn't see it, because the picture it was pointing toward was too far outside anything you'd considered possible? I want to hear from you. The small things, a bottle of perfume in the bathroom cabinet that I didn't own. I noticed it and thought, Claire must have left it when she stayed. I mentioned it to David, and he said, oh, I think Claire left that, should I mail it to her? I said sure. A book on the nightstand on what had always been my side of the bed. A novel I didn't own and hadn't read, with a bookmark in it at page 147. I thought, David's been sleeping on both sides while I was away. I moved the book to the other nightstand. My email, my personal email, not work, was logged out on my laptop. I had to log back in. I thought, the software updated while I was in the hospital. My LinkedIn profile had a new connection I didn't recognize. I thought, sometimes the algorithm connects you with people without your input. My best friend Nora called me 3 weeks after I was home. At the end of the call she said, carefully, Becca, I want to ask you something, and I need you to not be upset with me. I said, of course. She said, have you talked to Claire recently? I said we'd spoken once, the week I was in the hospital. A silence. I thought I saw her, Nora said. In town, a few weeks ago. She was with David. I want to tell you exactly what happened in the moment Nora said that. Nothing, externally. I kept my voice level. I said, oh, she must have visited while I was still in the hospital. That makes sense. Nora said, of course, you're right. I'm sorry to mention it. We said goodbye. Then I sat in the green chair by the window, the one David had wanted to replace for years, and that I had refused to get rid of. And I thought about the perfume and the book, and the logged out email, and the LinkedIn connection, and the quality of David's watching. And I tried to build the picture. My mind refused to build it. I tried again, and again. What I came to, finally, after sitting in that chair for a very long time, was not the picture. Not yet. What I came to was a decision. I needed more information before I could know what I was looking at. That decision, to look carefully and methodically, rather than ask David directly and accept his answer, is the decision that changed everything that came after. If I had asked David in that moment, he would have had an explanation. He always had explanations. I would have accepted it, because I was recently out of brain surgery and I had very little capacity to sustain suspicion against someone I had spent 9 years trusting. Instead, I started keeping a list. I am, by training and by nature, a person who solves problems visually. I make plans on paper before I make them in the world, because seeing the lines helps me understand the relationships between things in a way that interior reasoning doesn't always achieve. I began writing things down in a small notebook I kept in my work bag. Dates and observations and questions. The structure of what I was seeing, stripped of interpretation. Because when you strip something of interpretation and write down only what is observable, patterns emerge that feelings obscure. Observable fact, Claire's perfume in the bathroom. Observable fact, a book at page 147 on my nightstand. Observable fact, email logged out. Observable fact, LinkedIn connection I hadn't made. Observable fact, Nora saw Claire with David in Asheville, weeks after Claire had said she returned to Atlanta. Observable question, where exactly had Claire been for the past 3 months? I didn't ask David, I called Claire. The call lasted 4 minutes. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless, with the particular quality of someone who has seen a name on their screen and taken a moment to compose themselves before answering. Becca, hi, how are you feeling? Better, I said. I'm making progress. Listen, when did you go back to Atlanta? After the surgery. A pause, short but real. About a week after you went in, she said. I couldn't stay longer, I had things at home. Have you been up to Asheville recently? I asked as casually as I could manage, which was not very. Another pause, slightly longer. Not recently, she said. Why, no reason, I thought Nora mentioned seeing you. Nora must have been confused, Claire said. I haven't been up there since the surgery. She said it easily, smoothly, without the tells I was watching for, just the simple, flat assertion. I had known my sister for 37 years at that point. I had grown up sharing a bedroom with her, reading her face across dinner tables, understanding the specific calibration of her silences. And I could not tell, from that phone call, whether she was lying. That scared me more than anything else that had happened. I want to stop here and tell you something about my sister, because this story is not going to make sense if you think of Claire as a straightforwardly malicious person. She is not. She has never been. Claire and I grew up in the same house, with the same parents, in the same circumstances. We were treated, as our parents understood fairness, equally. Same opportunities, same expectations, same version of love offered in the same way, but twins are not mirrors. They are two separate people who happen to start at the same moment, and the fact that they started together makes the divergences more noticeable, not less. Because when you spend your childhood alongside someone who looks like you, who shares your history, who is constantly being measured against you by the world, you develop a particular relationship to comparison. You either transcend it or it shapes you. For Claire, comparison shaped her. I don't say this as a judgment. I didn't choose to be good at school. I didn't choose to have an easier time making friends, or to find the specific career that suited me, or to meet David, or to have any of the things that accrued around me while Claire was watching. Those things happened, and Claire watched them happen, and I don't know what it felt like to be her watching. I've tried to imagine it. I'm not sure imagination gets you there when it comes to someone else's pain. What I can tell you is what I observed, which is different from what I understood at the time. Claire was bright, that's not in question. She was quick and perceptive and had a quality of noticing things, small things, social things, the way a room changed when someone walked in, that I've always privately thought was sharper than my own. She was funny in a way that required intelligence. She was, when she wanted to be, the most interesting person in any gathering. And she was, for most of our childhood and adolescence, eclipsed, not because anyone intended it, not because our parents favored me or because I was deliberately competitive, but because the particular qualities that the world tends to reward in a fairly direct way, academic performance, professional ambition, the kind of steady forward momentum that looks like competence, those qualities came easily to me and did not come easily to Claire. And so we moved through our shared life, accumulating different scores on the metrics that the world uses to measure people. And by the time we were adults, there was a gap between those scores that neither of us had chosen, but that had become over years. A structure we both lived inside, we didn't talk about it. That was the agreement, unspoken, that our family had come to. We didn't name the dynamic, because naming it would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean deciding what to do about it, and deciding what to do about it was a conversation nobody knew how to have. So we didn't. Claire left home at 18 with the particular intensity of someone who has been waiting to become something other than what she is in relation to the person standing next to her. She went to Georgia for college, far enough to be her own person, close enough to stay connected. She got a degree in communications. She moved through a series of jobs that had the quality of things a person does while figuring out what they actually want. She was good at all of them in a general way that didn't crystallize into anything specific. She married a man named Aaron Whitfield in her late 20s. I was at the wedding. Aaron was decent and low-key, and I thought at the time, a good match for her, someone who was easy to be around, who didn't create drama, who made space for the person he was with rather than requiring them to orbit him. I liked him. I thought she'd chosen well. The marriage lasted 4 years. I don't know exactly what went wrong. Claire didn't tell me and I didn't push, and by then we were in the first stretch of the estrangement. Which meant that the information I was getting about her life was filtered through our mother, and then through Carol, and by the time it got to me, it was more impression than substance. What I understood was that the marriage had ended, and that Claire had ended it, and that she had moved back to Atlanta alone and was, apparently, starting over. That was 3 years before she called me in January and said she wanted to rebuild things between us. I've thought about that call a great deal since, about why she made it and when, and what the timing meant. She called me in January of the year that my marriage to David was starting, quietly, to fail, though I didn't know that yet, and she hadn't known him well enough to know it either at that point. Or so I believed. What I believe now is that the call was sincere. That she did miss me, that the divorce had made her think about what mattered, that she genuinely wanted to rebuild. And I also believe that what she found, when she rebuilt, when she came back into my life and met David properly and spent time in our house, created a want so powerful that it eventually overrode whatever good intentions had brought her back. That is a painful thing to believe. It would be easier to believe that the call was calculated from the beginning, that she came back with the plan already formed, that the warmth was entirely performance. It would make her more purely a villain and make the whole thing more legible. But I think the truth is messier than that. I think she came back to rebuild and found something she hadn't expected to find, and the wanting overwhelmed the rebuilding, and she made a series of choices that each had their own logic until the accumulated logic of them became something monstrous. I could be wrong. I often am about the inner lives of people I think I know. What I do know is that the woman who stood in my kitchen in April and laughed with my husband was not performing all of it. Some of it was real. Some of what she felt for me was real, in that visit and in the months that followed. And some of what she felt for David was real, in a way that made the rest of it, somehow, worse rather than better. Because the thing about being betrayed by someone who genuinely loves you, or some version of you, in some complicated and self-serving way, is that it doesn't resolve neatly into the categories we prefer. It doesn't let you say, "That person never cared about me." It makes you say, instead, "That person cared about me and did this anyway, and I have to live with both of those things being true at the same time. I have lived with both of those things for 2 years. I am still living with them. I will probably be living with them for a long time to come." What I did, in the weeks after the phone call with Claire, was this. I called NC State and asked whether anyone had recently requested a copy of my transcripts. They had. 6 weeks ago, via a written request from Rebecca M. Callahan, forwarded from a P.O. box in Atlanta, I checked my credit report. There was a new account, a credit card opened 4 months ago, during the 11 days of the coma, at an address in Asheville that was not mine. Current balance, $6,712. I checked with my professional licensing board. My landscape architecture license was current, but the contact email on file had been changed to a Gmail address I didn't recognize, with a username that was a slight variation on my name. I checked my health insurance. There was a new secondary insured added to the policy 4 months ago, Claire Ann Callahan, same last name. Claire had been married briefly, years ago, and had taken her husband's last name, which was not Callahan. She had apparently, at some point during the past 4 months, begun presenting herself under our shared birth name. And then I went to my doctor's office and asked whether anyone had requested a copy of my medical records recently. They had. 2 months ago, a written request, forwarded from a P.O. box in Atlanta, my complete medical history. I sat in the parking lot of my doctor's office for 45 minutes. Then I drove home and I did not say a word to David, and I started looking for a private investigator. Her name was Diane Ochoa. She came recommended by a divorce attorney I found through a friend who didn't know why I was looking. Diane was in her mid-50s, methodical, and had the quality I was learning to value above all others during this period. She said exactly what she knew and nothing more. I laid out everything for her. The evidence I'd assembled, the timeline, the phone call with Claire. She listened without interrupting, and at the end she said, "How much access to your life does your sister have, to your documents, your history?" "Theoretically, not much," I said. "Practically, she's my twin. She knows my social security number because we both memorized each other's as kids, it was a game. She knows where I went to school, my professional history. Does she know your mother's maiden name, childhood pets, first street you lived on?" I looked at her. "Every security question I've ever been asked," I said. "Yes," Diane nodded slowly. "I want to be clear about what we might be looking at," she said. "There's identity theft in the technical sense, credit cards, fraudulent accounts, and then there's what you're describing, which is more comprehensive. The transcripts, the licensing information, the medical records, the name change to Callahan." She looked at me. "Someone who is collecting those things is building something. They're assembling the documentation to present themselves in a limited and targeted way as you." "To do what?" I said, though I already knew. "I don't know yet," Diane said, "but I'd like to find out. I want to tell you something about the experience of hiring a private investigator, because I think people have a certain image of it that doesn't quite match what it's actually like. What it's actually like is, you hand someone a folder of things that have been keeping you awake at 3 in the morning, and you watch them treat those things with complete professional matter-of-factness, and you feel, for the first time in months, like you are not crazy. Like the things you noticed were real things, worth noticing, worth investigating. And not the paranoia of a woman who had brain surgery and is having trouble with word retrieval, and should probably just accept that her husband is a good man, and her sister loves her, and everything is fine. The validation of having a professional say, "Yes, this is worth looking into," was something I hadn't realized I needed until I had it. Diane worked methodically. She set up surveillance near the house on Ridgeview Court, legally, from public property. She traced the P.O. box in Atlanta back to a mail service company, which could not disclose the customer information directly but whose records, obtained through Patricia's legal channels later, would confirm what Diane already suspected. She ran searches on Claire's recent financial and residential activity and found, as I had found, the credit card and the altered licensing information and the rental agreement. She told me, during one of our check-in calls, that she had done similar work before: cases involving identity theft, cases involving family members, cases involving both at once. She said the pattern she was seeing was one she'd encountered in a different form several years earlier. Not the blunt, rapid identity theft of someone trying to open 20 credit cards in a week, but the slow, careful, deliberate construction of a parallel identity. The kind that requires patience and access and a long-term goal. The patience is what makes it different, she said. Opportunistic identity theft is fast. What your sister has been doing is slow. She's been building something. That takes time and it takes an endpoint. She knows where this is going, or she thinks she does. The marriage license, I said. The marriage license is the endpoint, Diane said. Everything else is infrastructure. Infrastructure, I've thought about that word many times since. The credit card and the transcripts and the fake ID and the altered licensing information and the medical records, all of it was infrastructure. All of it was in service of a single destination. A legal document filed at a county clerk's office that would make my twin sister officially, on paper, the woman my husband was about to marry. And then what? Diane had a theory about that too. She shared it carefully, noting that it was speculative, that she couldn't prove it, but that the pattern suggested it. If the marriage had gone through, if I had not been located before the license was filed, or if Linda Parfit had not made her call, Claire would have been, in a limited but legally significant sense, my substitute. Not me, obviously. But a woman with documents in my name, a professional history in my name, a marriage to my husband in my name. David would have known the truth. Claire would have known the truth. And I would have been 4 states away in Tucson, in a rented room, with my legal and financial life quietly oriented around a person who was presenting herself as me. The question of what came next, whether they would have maintained the deception indefinitely, or whether there was a further plan, or whether the plan had only been to get to the marriage and then figure out the rest, I don't know the answer to that. Neither does Diane, neither does Patricia. What I know is what they built, and what it would have produced if they'd succeeded. I want to tell you about what it was like to be in Tucson during all of this. Because I've described the investigation in the way investigations tend to get described, as a sequence of discoveries, each one building toward the next, and that description is accurate but incomplete. It misses the texture of the period, what it was actually like to be living through it. I was in a single room in a house that belonged to a man named Gary, who was David's college friend, and who was, I understood in retrospect, almost certainly not aware of the full situation. He thought he was doing a friend a favor by hosting a friend's wife who was recovering from surgery. He was kind and low-key, and left me to my own devices, which was what I needed. The room had a window that faced west, and in the evenings the light that came through it was extraordinary, the specific Tucson light of late afternoon, orange and amber, the kind that makes everything look like the last scene before something changes. I spent a lot of time in that light, sitting at the small desk, doing the work of the investigation, calling agencies, checking records, making lists. The cognitive fragility from the surgery was still present during that period. Not disabling, I was functional, I could work, I could drive, I could hold a sustained conversation. But it had a specific character. Under stress, in moments of overload, my word retrieval would slip. I'd be in the middle of a sentence, and the next word would simply not be there, the slot where it should be occupied by a blank that I had to wait out. I'd pause, the word would come back, I'd continue. This happened during my phone call with the NC State Transcripts Office, during the conversation with the Credit Reporting Agency, during the first call with Diane. Each time I paused and waited and continued, and nobody said anything, but I was acutely aware of it. This evidence of the surgery, of the fragility, of the fact that my brain had been cut open 4 months ago and was still in the process of reestablishing itself. I thought about Claire during those pauses. I thought about the fact that she did not have these pauses. That whatever she had built, the documentation, the fake ID, the credit card, the job application, she had built with a fully functional brain while mine was slowly healing. That while I was in a coma for 11 days, she had been in my house, in my life, assembling the infrastructure. The asymmetry of it was the thing that was hardest to sit with. Not the betrayal in the abstract, the fact of it, in the abstract, I could hold. What I couldn't hold, in those pauses where my words went away, was the specific image of her working methodically and deliberately during the days I was absent from myself. Moving through the house, going through my desk, making her requests to the licensing board, the transcripts office, using the interval of my unconsciousness the way you use a gap in traffic, efficiently, without hesitation, before the window closed. I cried during that period more than I had since I was a child. Not dramatically, I'm not a dramatic person, and the crying didn't announce itself or arrive in waves. It would just come quietly at specific moments. When I found the credit card account. When I opened the licensing board confirmation that showed my contact information had been changed. When I first talked to Patricia Sue and said the word divorce out loud and heard it land in the air between us like something dropped. I let it come, and I let it go, and I went back to the list. I think that's what I want to say about Tucson, really, that it was a period of simultaneously falling apart and building something. That those two things, which seem incompatible, were actually happening at the same time, in the same body, in the same room with the extraordinary Western light. That the grief and the investigation and the list-making were not separate activities, but the same activity, the activity of a person who is trying to understand what happened to her, which requires first allowing herself to feel what happened to her, which is its own kind of work. I didn't know during that period whether I would be okay. I mean that plainly. I had had brain surgery. I was recovering, alone, in another person's house, in a city I had never lived in. My husband was 4 states away planning to marry my twin sister. The full picture of what I was dealing with was still being assembled. I didn't know yet about the insurance policy, or Kevin, or Margaret. I only knew the parts I'd found so far, and those parts were already too much. There were evenings when I sat in the western light and thought, I don't know how to do this. And then I got up and made something to eat and called Nora and went to bed, and in the morning I did the next thing on the list. Not because I was brave, I want to be very clear about that. Because the list was there, and the next thing was specific, and doing specific things is sometimes the only way through a period when the larger picture is too large to look at directly. The list kept me alive in the period before the picture was complete. That and Nora, that and the Western light, that and Dr. Patricia Vega's voice in my memory saying you're young and healthy and a good candidate, which I had started to hear, in that room in Tucson, as something more general than it was originally intended. Diane called me on a Tuesday morning, about 2 weeks after I'd hired her. She said she had something significant and asked me to come in. She had a file, photographs, printed documents, screen captures. She set them on the table in front of me in a specific order, which I understood, watching her do it, was deliberate. She was building to something, and she wanted me to have context before I got there. The first photographs were of Claire in Asheville. Time-stamped from the past 3 months. She had been in Asheville for at least part of almost every week during that time. She had been in several of the photographs, at or near the house on Ridgeview Court. The next set of photographs, Claire and David, together. Not in a platonic sibling-in-law way, in a way that answered a question I had been carefully not asking myself for weeks. I looked at those photographs for a moment. Then I set them aside and looked at Diane and said, "Keep going." The documents. An application for a position at an architecture firm in Asheville, a client liaison and project management role, with a firm I knew and respected. Applied for under the name Rebecca M. Callahan. With my transcripts, a carefully curated section of my portfolio, and a resume that was mine in every verifiable detail. Claire had applied for a job as me, a rental agreement for an apartment on the other side of Asheville, signed by Rebecca Callahan. With Claire's photograph on the ID that had been used to verify identity, an ID that bore my name and her face. And the last document, the one Diane set in front of me without saying anything, a marriage license application. Filed at the Buncombe County Clerk's office 10 days ago. David Arthur Harmon and Rebecca Marie Callahan. David's name. My name. His handwriting on the groom's line. And on the bride's line, my name, in handwriting that was almost mine. The handwriting of someone who had practiced. She was going to marry my husband, using my name and my life and the documentation she had assembled over 4 months. She was going to become, in every official and documentable sense, me. And I had been 4 states away in Tucson, recovering, because David had suggested, gently, reasonably, with the attentive warmth I had spent 9 years finding reassuring, that I should spend my recovery period somewhere warm and dry. That the altitude and the damp of Asheville winter were bad for recovery. That his college friend had a spare room in Tucson, and it would be good for me to rest somewhere different. He had sent me away. And then applied for a marriage license with my sister. I want to be honest about the next part, because it's the part people ask about most. I did not fall apart. I've been asked whether I cried, sitting in Diane's office with those documents in front of me, and the answer is no. I didn't cry then, and I didn't cry for a long time after. What I felt, in that moment, was very cold and very clear, the way you feel sometimes in an emergency when your body decides that feeling can wait, and what is needed now is function. I looked at Diane and I said, "What do I need to do?" And she said, "Talk to a lawyer today." I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Patricia Sue, and she was a family law attorney who also had experience with identity theft cases, and she was someone who said exactly what she knew and nothing more. I gave her everything. She was quiet for a while, looking through it. Then she said, "There are several distinct legal issues here. The identity theft, the credit card, the fraudulent ID, the use of your professional credentials, those are criminal matters. The marriage license application is potentially bigamy, since your marriage to David is still legally in force." She looked at me, "And there's the question of your marriage itself, which is a civil matter. Do you want to divorce David, or do you want to pursue other remedies?" "Divorce," I said. She nodded and kept writing. Here is the twist that came next, and I want you to understand that I did not see it coming, even with everything I already knew. Patricia referred me to a forensic accountant named Gerald Fitch, who spent 2 weeks going through the financial records she obtained through the discovery process. He found things. David's retirement account had been partially liquidated, over the course of the past 2 years, in amounts small enough not to trigger immediate alarm, totaling just under $40,000. He found a separate account I had not known about, in David's name alone, at a different bank, containing $63,000. And then Gerald found something else. He found a life insurance policy, taken out 18 months ago, on my life, with David as the sole beneficiary. In the amount of $800,000. I want to give you a moment with that number. $800,000. The policy had been taken out before the surgery. Before the diagnosis, even it had been opened in January of the year, I was diagnosed in September. Which meant it predated the medical situation that would make such a policy immediately relevant. Unless David had known something was wrong before I did. Unless the headaches had been visible to him before they were visible to me, and he had done the math. I don't know this. I cannot prove it. It may be coincidence. It may be the prudent financial planning of a man who thought about the future. It may be something else entirely. Gerald Fitch brought it to Patricia. Patricia brought it to me. We brought it to law enforcement. And law enforcement, after looking at everything together, the insurance policy, the hidden account, the liquidated retirement funds, the suggestion that I leave Asheville to recover, the marriage license application, opened a separate investigation. There were others involved. This is the part people don't usually expect. David had a younger brother named Kevin. He worked in insurance sales. He had always been a peripheral figure in my life. Pleasant enough, not close, the kind of person who shows up at Christmas and doesn't leave much of an impression. What the civil discovery revealed was that Kevin had known about the affair for at least 18 months before the surgery. David had told him, not as a confession, more, from the messages that Patricia's team obtained, as a kind of confiding between brothers. Kevin had been complicit. He had also been doing his own arithmetic. He worked in insurance sales. He would have understood, better than David perhaps, the implications of a policy on a wife who was about to have brain surgery. And he had been, the records showed, involved in the selection of that policy, had recommended the specific product from the specific carrier with the specific terms. In exchange for a referral fee, which is standard industry practice and not in itself criminal. Except that the referral fee had been structured in a way that created a paper trail pointing away from Kevin and toward David, in the event that the policy ever came under scrutiny. Kevin had received his fee and arranged matters so that if questions were asked, he was simply the helpful family member who had connected David with a good product. He was not charged criminally. There was not enough direct evidence. But the civil case resulted in a judgment against him for the referral fee plus penalties. He sent an attorney to the proceeding. I have not spoken to him since. There is one more person, the one who surprised me most. The one I sat with the longest before I could include her here. Her name is Margaret, David's mother. A woman I had called Mom for 9 years who had welcomed me with warmth that I always experienced as genuine. Who had brought food when I was sick and called on my birthday and told me more than once that I was the best thing that had happened to her son. She knew, not everything, not Kevin's involvement, not the insurance policy, but she knew about Claire. She had known for several months before the surgery. David had told her sometime that summer, she said in her letter, when it had become serious enough that he felt he needed to tell someone. David had told her, the way people sometimes tell the one person they trust most, believing that person will keep the secret because keeping it serves the relationship. Margaret had kept it. She had sat across from me at her kitchen table multiple times during that year, and she had said nothing. She had made the food and called on the birthday and looked me in the eye and said I was the best thing that had happened to her son. I found this through her messages to David obtained through the discovery process, a conversation over the course of that summer and fall as the affair developed in which she expressed concern, and then expressed acceptance, and then settled into the careful silence of someone who has decided that what she doesn't say cannot be held against her. I want to be fair to Margaret. She was in an impossible position. She knew something that would have destroyed her son's life to reveal, and she was his mother, and whatever her failings, she loved him. I understand that. I do not think she is a monster. I also know that for 9 years I called her Mom, and she let me. She sent me a letter, about a year after the trials. A long letter, handwritten, that said everything you'd expect, the apology, the explanation, the acknowledgement that she should have told me, the acknowledgement that she had loved me in her way and that the love and the silence had coexisted. I wrote back, a shorter letter. I said I wasn't ready to rebuild anything, that I needed time, that I appreciated her writing. I meant all of it. That's where we are, in the uncertain middle, which is, I've come to understand, where most things that matter actually live. David was arrested in Asheville on charges that included identity theft conspiracy, wire fraud, and based on the life insurance policy and the financial picture, attempted fraud. The investigators' working theory was that David and Claire had been in a relationship for considerably longer than I knew, and that my surgery had appeared to represent an opportunity that they had not fully resisted. The attempted fraud charge related to the insurance policy. The theory being that if I had not survived, the policy would have paid out, and David would have had a dead wife and a living woman named Rebecca Callahan available to step into that wife's life. I cannot prove this. The investigators built a circumstantial case. David's attorney argued the policy was unrelated, the timing coincidence, no direct evidence of intent to harm. The jury was not entirely convinced either way. Claire was arrested the same day. Her charges were cleaner, the ones with documentary evidence, the ones that did not require a jury to conclude anything about intent beyond what the documents themselves demonstrated. The credit card, the fake ID, the transcripts, the license information, the medical records, the job application in my name. The marriage license application. I did not attend either arrest. I watched the calls come in. I read the texts from Nora, who had driven past the house on Ridgeview Court when the police cars were there, and sent me a photograph because she thought I needed to see that it was real. I stared at that photograph for a long time. It was real. David's trial was first. The fraud charges were argued with considerable sophistication on both sides. The prosecution presented the financial picture, the hidden account, the liquidated retirement funds, the insurance policy, and argued that this was a man who had been systematically positioning himself to profit from his wife's death. The defense presented a man who had made poor financial choices, fallen into an affair, and handled it badly, but who was not a murderer and had not been proved to have planned anything beyond the marriage license application. I testified. I had thought I was prepared for it. I was not entirely prepared for it. What I hadn't accounted for was the particular experience of sitting in a witness box and describing, in precise and specific detail, a life that no longer exists. The Italy trip, the playlist he made in the hospital, the 9 years of whatever you need. You describe these things under oath, in careful factual language, and the act of describing them makes them real in a way that grief, which has its own foggy quality, doesn't quite achieve. You understand, giving testimony, exactly what was lost. Not the marriage in the abstract, the specific and irreplaceable accumulation of moments that constituted a shared life, now disassembled. I held it together on the stand, just barely and not in every moment but enough. The jury convicted him on the identity theft conspiracy charge because the evidence of his coordination with Claire was clear. They acquitted on the attempted fraud charge because the insurance policy alone was not sufficient to prove intent. He was sentenced to 4 years. He served 2.5. I want to say something about the verdict, because I know people who followed this case had strong feelings about the acquittal on the fraud charge, and I've been asked whether I think justice was done. My honest answer is, partially. The identity theft conviction was right and deserved. The acquittal on the fraud charge left something unresolved that I suspect will remain unresolved, not because the jury was wrong, but because the law was doing what the law does, which is require a level of certainty that the available evidence didn't achieve. The insurance policy could have been coincidence. The timing could have been coincidence. No one can look inside another person's mind and know what they intended, and the law, correctly, requires more than circumstance. What I know, what I carry, is my own assessment, which is not a legal one and doesn't need to be. My assessment is that a man who took out an $800,000 policy on his wife's life 18 months before her brain surgery, while conducting an affair with her twin sister, while quietly liquidating retirement funds, while planning a marriage license application with her twin sister, that man was not acting in good faith. What he was building, and what he was planning, I cannot prove. But I know what it looks like from where I was standing. I live with that. I'm not sure I was ever going to get a verdict that resolved it. Claire's trial came 8 months later. The documentary evidence against her was overwhelming. Her attorney attempted an argument centered on diminished responsibility, a narrative about a lifetime of comparison to her twin, of feeling inadequate and overlooked, of being in a relationship with David that she experienced as the first time she had ever been chosen over me. I was asked about this narrative during testimony by Claire's own defense attorney. She asked me whether it was true that I had, throughout our childhood, been perceived as the more successful twin, whether our family dynamics had created a situation in which Claire felt chronically overshadowed. I said, yes. I believe that's true. She asked whether I had been aware of this while it was happening. I said, not as clearly as I wish I had been. She asked whether, if I had been more aware, I thought things might have been different. I sat with that question for a moment. Maybe, I said, but I didn't steal her identity, and whatever she felt about our dynamic, that didn't give her the right to take my life. The attorney moved on. But I kept sitting with it, on the stand and afterward. The question of whether things might have been different. Whether a different version of our relationship, more honest, more direct, more willing to name what was actually happening between us, might have produced a different outcome. I don't know, I genuinely don't know. I believe the dynamic between us was real, and that it caused Claire real pain, and that some responsibility for not addressing that dynamic rests with me, as well as with our parents, and with the ways families collectively decide not to see what they don't know how to fix. I believe that. I also believe that the path from that pain to what she did required a series of choices, each of which had an alternative. That pain is not the same as compulsion. That being hurt does not give you permission to hurt back in this particular way. That she was a person with agency, not just a consequence of a family dynamic. Both of those things are true, holding both of them is the work. Claire was convicted on all charges. She was sentenced to 6 years. I want to tell you about a moment that happened during Claire's sentencing hearing because I think it belongs here. The judge asked Claire whether she had anything to say before sentencing. Claire looked at me. I was in the gallery. She found me immediately. We have always been able to find each other in rooms. Twins do this without quite understanding how, and she looked at me directly and she said, "I know what I did was wrong. I know there's no explanation that makes it okay. But Becca, you need to know that what I felt for David was real. That I didn't do this for money or for cruelty. I did it because I loved him, and because I convinced myself, somehow, that if I could just be you for long enough, I could have what you had." She stopped. "I know that makes it worse," she said. "I know that doesn't make it better. I just needed you to know." The judge sentenced her to 6 years. I sat in the gallery and I thought about what she had said. I am still thinking about it. Because here is the thing that I keep returning to, the thing that makes this story hard to tell in a clean way with clear villains. She was right that it made it worse. And she was also right that it made a different kind of sense. She had spent 37 years in my shadow, or in what she experienced as my shadow, in the shadow that comparison casts even when no one intends it. And she had found, finally, something she wanted that was not a version of what I had but the actual thing itself. That doesn't make it right. It was not right, it was not excusable, and I do not forgive it. But it was real. She was a real person, doing a terrible thing, for reasons that were tangled up with something that had been tangled between us since we were born. Understanding that is more complicated than a simple story of villainy, and I have had to make peace with the fact that it's complicated, because the alternative is a version of events that is cleaner and simpler and less true. 3 months after Claire's sentencing, I was going through boxes, the boxes from storage, from the unit outside Tucson where I'd put things during the proceedings. In one of those boxes, I found a journal. Mine. The kind I used to keep sporadically, in the way that some people write things down when they can't stop thinking about them. The last entries were from the year before the surgery. I hadn't opened it since. I sat on the floor and I read it. What I found there made me put it down and walk outside and stand in the yard for a long time. Because in those last entries, written in my handwriting, in my voice, months before I had any reason to suspect anything, I had written things down that I had, apparently, noticed and then immediately decided not to think about. An entry from February of that year: "David came home late again, 3rd time this week. He said the hotel had an event, he seemed somewhere else. I made dinner and he ate it and thanked me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was thanking me the way you thank a waiter, politely, at the correct moment, without seeing who is actually holding the plate." An entry from May: "Claire called. She and David talked for almost an hour while I was in the bath. I could hear him laughing. He doesn't laugh like that with me anymore. That is probably a thought I should not be having, and I am going to stop having it right now." An entry from August, 2 months before the surgery: "I keep having the thought that something is off. Not a specific thing. Just a general quality of offness, like a piece of music played in the wrong key, technically correct but somehow wrong in a way that's hard to name. I've been telling myself it's the headaches. That I'm tired and the headaches are making everything feel wrong. That is probably true. I sat on the floor of my new house and I held that journal and I thought, I knew, not fully, not consciously. Not in a way I could have acted on without more. But somewhere underneath the explanations I had constructed, I had known that something was wrong. And I had decided not to pursue it. Not out of cowardice, exactly. Out of the particular fear that comes when you sense that looking closely at something might destroy it. The fear that says, if I really look, I might find something I can't unlook from, and then I'll have to make choices I'm not ready to make. And so you look sideways. You write it in a journal and you close the journal and you tell yourself it's the headaches. My therapist, her name is Dr. Sharon Reeves, and to whom I owe a significant portion of my continued functional existence, said something about this that I've carried with me since. She said, "What you're describing is not a failure of perception. You perceived correctly. What you failed to do was act on the perception." And the question worth sitting with is, why? Because I was afraid, I said. Afraid of what specifically? Afraid that what I'd find would mean the end of something, the end of the marriage, the end of my relationship with Claire, maybe both. "And were you wrong about that?" "No," I said. "It was the end of both." "So the fear was accurate," Sharon said. "You correctly identified that looking closely would cost you something significant. Most of us make the same choice you made. Protect the house rather than inspect the foundation, because inspecting the foundation means accepting the possibility that the house needs to come down. The house needed to come down. Looking back, it needed to come down. The foundations were wrong from a point that predated me. And the house coming down, all of it, the marriage and the illusion of the sisterly relationship, and the life I'd constructed on top of those foundations, was the necessary condition for building something that could actually hold. I know that, I believe it. I also know that I sat in that journal and saw the early tremors and covered my ears, and that I will have to live with that particular version of myself, the one who noticed and decided not to look for the rest of my life. That is its own kind of reckoning. During the investigation, Diane Ochoa found something that did not make it into any of the official proceedings, something that was tangential to the legal case and that the prosecutors chose not to pursue because they had enough without it. She found messages between David and Claire from 4 years before the surgery. I chose to read them. I want to be honest about that. It was a choice, and I made it with full awareness that what I found would not make me feel better. The messages were what you'd expect. Two people who had fallen into something they shouldn't have, talking about it in the circular way that people do, equal parts justification and longing and guilt. But there was something in them that surprised me. David at one point had written, "I feel like I'm living in the wrong life. Not wrong exactly, just this is not the life I thought I'd have." Claire had written back, "I know exactly what you mean." And then David had written something I've thought about many times since. He wrote, "The thing is, I think Becca is happy. I really do. She loves her work and she loves this city and she loves what we've built. She's in the life I wanted to want. And I can't tell whether that means I love her or whether it means I married the idea of her. The idea of her, I don't have a clean response to that. I've sat with it long enough to know that it's a real thing, that people sometimes fall in love with an idea, and then spend years being married to the person underneath the idea, and find that the gap between those two things is unbridgeable. I don't think David is a monster for that. I think he is someone who married without fully understanding himself, and who handled that discovery as badly as it is possible to handle it. I also think he married the idea of me, and my sister tried to become the idea of me, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I was a real person living a real life and nobody involved asked me what I thought about any of it. That's what I keep coming back to in the end. Not the betrayal, not the theft, not the legal proceedings, just nobody asked me. I was the subject of all of it, the planning, the displacement, the fraud, the impersonation. My life was the object being competed over, transferred, applied for, and I was the last person in the room to know. The last to know, and the one it cost the most. I moved back to Asheville 8 months after the arrests. Asheville is home, the mountains are home, and I couldn't stay away indefinitely. I did not go back to the house on Ridgeview Court. It was sold during the divorce proceedings. I found a smaller place near the River Arts District. With a yard, I slowly began to work with the way landscape architects work with things, observing first, then shaping. Nora was there. She had kept vigil in a way I'll never be able to repay, calling every few days, making the drive to Tucson once to sit with me for a weekend. She is the kind of friend who does not treat a crisis as an occasion to demonstrate that she is a good person. She just does the things. She shows up. She does not require you to be more okay than you are. I've thought a lot about Nora during this period and what she represents, which is the inverse of what Claire and David represent. Claire and David used closeness as access. Nora used it as shelter. The same proximity, the same intimacy, deployed in opposite directions, one to take, one to protect. It sounds simple when I put it that way. It wasn't simple when I was living it. Because Nora is not simple either, she has her own complications, her own history, the ways she sometimes holds things too close and gets overwhelmed. She is not a saint. But she is someone who, when it mattered, used what closeness she had with me to keep me from coming apart. I think about that a lot. About the question of what closeness is for. What it is that you do with the knowledge of another person, the specific, intimate knowledge that accumulates over years of real friendship. You can use it to help them, you can use it to harm them, you can use it to do nothing, which is its own choice. Nora used hers to help. That's not a small thing. It's actually everything. I rebuilt my professional life. There were people in the local architecture community who had encountered Claire presenting as me and who needed careful, gentle explanation. There was the firm that had considered her application. That conversation was particularly strange. There were LinkedIn connections I didn't recognize who had been cultivated by someone impersonating me. I updated every security question I had ever set, changed every password, placed a credit freeze. And I developed a relationship with my own documentation, my credit, my professional records, my accounts, that I hadn't had before, because I know now what can happen in the spaces where you're not watching. That hypervigilance has a cost. I am aware of it. I'm working on calibrating it into something sustainable, into appropriate attention rather than exhausting surveillance. It's a work in progress. I also started therapy, 4 months into the Tucson period. Dr. Sharon Reeves, whose name I mentioned earlier, who meets me every 2 weeks in an office with too many plants, and a particular quality of stillness that I have come to associate with the kind of attention that is actually paid. Therapy has been its own education. I went in expecting to talk about what happened, the fraud, the betrayal, the grief of losing the marriage and Claire at the same time, and we have talked about all of that. But what I didn't expect was how much of the work would be about what came before, about the conditions that made what happened possible, about the ways I had been living slightly sideways to my own perceptions for years, explaining things away, deciding not to look. Sharon has a phrase she uses for this. She calls it protective not knowing. The state of understanding that something is wrong but choosing, at the level of conscious thought, not to assemble the pieces into a picture. Because the picture, once assembled, requires action, and the action will cost you something you're not ready to lose. I had been in a state of protective not knowing for at least 2 years before the surgery. The journal entries made that clear. The February entry, the May entry, the August entry, each one a small moment of almost seeing, followed immediately by the decision to look away. The question Sharon helped me sit with was not, "Why didn't you see it?" The question was, "What were you protecting?" And the answer, which took me a long time to arrive at honestly, was, myself. The version of myself that was in a good marriage, in a good life, in a good city, with a good sister coming back into her life. The version of myself that I had built carefully over many years, and that I did not want to dismantle on the basis of a feeling I couldn't fully name. I was protecting a story. Not a lie, exactly. The story was real in its way, for the years it was real. But by the time the May entry was written, he doesn't laugh like that with me anymore. The story was more construction than truth. And I knew it, in the way you know things when you're not quite letting yourself think about them, and I kept building anyway. I don't tell you this to punish myself. I tell you this because I think it matters practically. Because the people who experience what I experienced, who have the intimate knowledge of someone they loved used against them, are often asked, implicitly or explicitly, why they didn't see it sooner. And the answer is almost never that they were foolish or inattentive. The answer is almost always that they were protecting something, a relationship, a version of their life, a story that still felt worth protecting. The protection is not weakness, it is human. But it is also worth examining, because the price of protection, when the thing you're protecting is already damaged at the foundation, is ultimately much higher than the price of looking. I went back to work. Because work, the actual work of landscape architecture, the problem solving and the drawing and the hours spent thinking about how space should function, had always been the thing that kept me sane, and it kept me sane again. There is something about the scale of it that helped. Not grandiose work, mostly residential gardens, small commercial spaces, the occasional public project. Work that is bounded and specific and that produces visible results in a time frame you can actually observe. You plant things, they grow or they don't. You adjust, you try again. The growing season is indifferent to what's happening in your life. The plants don't know you've had a hard year. That indifference, which might sound cold, was actually what I needed. To be in the presence of something that required attention and patience and skill, and that didn't care at all about my feelings. I found, going back, that I was better at parts of the work than I'd been before. More patient with the early stages of a project, with the period of observation before intervention. More willing to let what was already there inform what should be done, rather than imposing a vision without regard for the existing conditions. That is, I think, what extended suffering teaches you if you let it, not a lesson in the easy inspirational sense, but in the slow and procedural sense of a person who has had to rebuild from actual conditions rather than ideal ones. You learn to work with what's there. You learn that the existing thing, however damaged, contains information that the new design needs in order to hold. The hiring partner at the firm Claire had applied to, a woman named Helen Graves, asked if I'd be willing to talk through what had happened so her firm could update their verification procedures. We met twice. In those meetings, she described the candidate she had interviewed. She said she was impressive. She knew the field. She talked about your actual projects as though she'd lived them, which I suppose she had in some sense through you. She was confident, specific, had answers for things I didn't even ask. She had my whole life to prepare, I said. Yes, there was one moment though. We were talking about the residential work, your private garden projects, and she got slightly vague. She could describe the projects in broad terms, but she couldn't answer the specific questions that someone who had actually done the work would answer automatically. The kind of knowledge that's in your hands, not your head. The knowledge that's in your hands, not your head. That phrase stayed with me, because there is a kind of expertise that lives in the body, that comes from doing rather than studying, from years of adjusting and problem-solving in real space that gradually become instinct. Claire had my transcripts and my portfolio and my professional history. She didn't have the years behind them. She could have my name. She could not have what the name represented. That distinction matters to me. I've needed it to matter. I want to tell you something I've thought about a great deal since. The thing that saved me, the specific, concrete thing, was Linda Parfit making a phone call she was not required to make. She told me, in the card she sent a year later, that she hadn't known how to begin the call, and she had chosen the framing "your husband wanted me to call you" because she thought it might make me more receptive to what came next. She was technically wrong. David had not asked her to call, but she had been right in the way that mattered. If she had called and said, "I found a marriage license application in your name, and I don't think you know about it," I might have frozen. The gentler framing had given me enough footing to keep listening. She had been wrong, and she had been right simultaneously, and the result had been 6 words that changed everything. There are Linda Parfits all around us. People who notice things and have the choice of calling or not calling, speaking or staying silent, following the protocol or following the instinct. People whose small acts of attention create the conditions for larger rescues. Be a Linda Parfit. If something tells you to call, call. Even if you're not sure, even if you don't know exactly how to begin, even if the framing isn't perfect, just call. People ask me whether I've spoken to Claire, whether I plan to, whether there's a version of this that ends in reconciliation. I don't have a clean answer. She's in prison, and I have not visited, and our communication has been limited to 2 brief letters, one from her, one from me. Her letter said what she said at sentencing, expanded and more carefully articulated. My letter said that I needed time and that I didn't know yet what time would bring. That's still true. I'm not ready to close the door on the idea of her. She is my twin. She is the person who shared my first room and my first years, and the particular closeness of 2 people who began together. She did something unforgivable, in the practical sense that I don't know whether it can be forgiven. And she is also a person I have known since before I knew anything, and the grief of losing her is its own thing, separate from the anger, separate from the betrayal. Both things are true. What I know is that I am not responsible for the choices she made. That whatever she felt about our dynamic, those feelings do not create a debt that she was entitled to collect by taking my life. I did not owe her my name. The yard at the house on the River Arts District has been my project for the past year. It was, when I arrived, in the condition that rented yards often are: tired, slightly neglected, with the traces of multiple previous tenants' intentions visible in what they'd planted and abandoned. I cleared some things and kept others. I found a climbing rose that someone had planted against the south fence, probably 20 years ago, that had survived all the changes of tenure by virtue of being left alone and having deep roots. I kept it. I built around it. In the spring it bloomed red. Not the color I would have chosen. I'm glad I didn't choose it. That's the thing about what's already there. Sometimes it's better than what you would have designed. Sometimes the existing thing, the thing that survived, turns out to be the most important element of the whole. About 6 months after I moved back, I was at a nursery on the east side of town when a woman stopped beside me and said, "Rebecca." I turned around. She was in her late 50s, silver hair, the kind of face that suggests someone who has spent a lot of time outdoors. "I thought you looked familiar. You did the greenway planting on the Riverside project, maybe 3 years ago. I was on the planning committee." "That was me," I said. We talked for 20 minutes. She had good instincts and real questions. By the end of the conversation, she had taken my card and I had taken hers. On the way to my car, I thought, that's what remains, not the fraud, not the impersonation. Not the version of me that Claire tried to become, that David tried to replace me with, that a marriage license in Buncombe County tried to make official. What remains is the actual work. The actual years. The actual knowledge in my hands that no one can obtain with a transcript request or a set of security questions. The greenway planting on the Riverside project 3 years ago. Mine, fully mine. Still there, still functioning, still doing what I designed it to do. You can take a name, you cannot take the thing behind it. I am Rebecca Marie Callahan. I am a landscape architect. I had a marriage, and I had a twin sister, and I had a brain surgery, and I had a period during which someone tried to become me while I was recovering, and none of it succeeded in making me someone else. I am still exactly who I was in that parking lot, plus everything that happened after. I want to tell you what the after has actually looked like, because I think the way stories like this tend to end, with the clean statement of survival, the declaration of selfhood. The "you can take a name but not what it represents" can make recovery sound more complete than it is, can make it sound like something you arrive at, rather than something you're always still in the middle of. I am always still in the middle of it. I want to be honest about that. There are days, fewer now than a year ago, but still present, when I wake up in the morning and have a moment, before I'm fully conscious, before the day's full context has loaded, when I am just a person in a house in Asheville. And then the loading completes, and I remember that my ex-husband applied for a marriage license with my twin sister, that my sister built a documentation kit using my identity while I was in a coma, that my brother-in-law structured an insurance referral to protect himself, that my mother-in-law knew and stayed silent. I remember all of that, and I get up and make coffee and do the day. But there is a cost to the remembering that is not dramatic and not debilitating, and that doesn't photograph well, but that is real. It is simply the weight of carrying a knowledge that most people don't carry. The knowledge of what the closest people are capable of. The knowledge that closeness and safety are not the same thing, and that the people who know you best also know best how to hurt you. I carry that. I will probably always carry it. The question, which Sharon has helped me work on, is not how to put it down. I don't think I get to put it down, but how to carry it without it determining the shape of everything else. How to be a person who has been through this and who is still open, still willing to extend trust, still capable of genuine closeness, knowing what closeness can be used for. That's the ongoing project. I've gotten better at it. I have relationships now that feel, to the extent that I can assess such things, healthy and real. Nora, who is always real, and several people I've met in the 2 years since returning to Asheville. including a colleague named James, who teaches landscape theory at UNCA, and who is the kind of person you can sit with for 3 hours and lose track of time. I don't know yet what that is or where it goes. I'm trying to resist the urge to assess it too early, to run the forensic analysis before there's enough data to analyze. That's the work. Holding the knowledge of what happened without applying it as a filter to every new thing. I've started running again, which is its own small story. Before the surgery, I had run the way a lot of people run, 30 minutes, a few times a week, not because I loved it, but because it kept my head clear and my body functional. After the surgery, I hadn't run. The fatigue made it impossible at first, and then I simply didn't, the way you don't do things in a period when the basics take all your available energy. I started again last spring. Short runs, early mornings, along the river. The first run lasted 12 minutes. I was winded in a way that would have embarrassed me 3 years ago. I didn't care, I was running. I was in my body, the body that had brain surgery and recovered and kept going, and I was moving through the city that has always been home, and nobody had taken that from me. The running has gotten longer. I'm at 40 minutes now, most mornings. It is not impressive, and it doesn't need to be. I also had a conversation, about 6 months ago, with a woman named Helen Ackefer who works at a domestic violence resource center in Asheville. She had heard, through the community grapevine, something of what had happened to me, enough to reach out and ask whether I'd be willing to talk to her about my experience, specifically the aspects related to coercive control and psychological manipulation, which are areas her organization works in. I said yes. We talked for 2 hours. At the end, she asked whether I'd be willing to speak to some of the people they work with, in an informal way, not as an authority or a counselor, but as someone who has been through something and survived it and might have something useful to say. I said I'd think about it, and then I thought about it and I said yes. I've now spoken, informally, to 3 groups of people at the resource center. People in the middle of situations, much harder than mine in many ways, physically dangerous, economically precarious, with children involved, with far fewer of the resources I had available to me. And I've talked about what I know, which is this: the manipulation that happened to me was not about physical force. It was about information management, what I was allowed to know and what was kept from me. About the use of intimacy as a mechanism, the way the knowledge that accrues in a close relationship becomes, in the wrong hands, the raw material for harm. About the particular disorientation of finding that the story you were living was not the story that was actually happening. I don't know if what I've said has helped anyone specifically. I hope it has. What I know is that saying it, taking what happened to me, and converting it into something with a function, something that might be of use to someone else, is part of the carrying. Part of how you carry the weight without letting it determine the shape of everything. You can take a name, you cannot take the thing behind it, that is true. And the thing behind my name, the 40-minute morning runs and the River Arts District Yard, and the Greenway planting, and the conversations with Sharon and the groups at the resource center, and the 3 hours with James and the slow, careful rebuilding of a life that is mine in the way I need it to be mine, that thing is intact, not unchanged, not unmarked by what happened, but intact. I am still here. There is something I haven't told you yet, and it belongs at the end. About 6 months after Claire was sentenced, I received a letter from her. A real letter, handwritten, not the first communication she'd attempted, but the first I'd responded to with more than a word. She said what she'd said at sentencing, more fully. She said she knew the damage was real and that she wasn't asking me to minimize it. She said she had been in therapy since her incarceration and was trying to understand, for the first time with actual help, the nature of what she had done and why. She said she was not sure she would ever fully understand it. She said she thought she had spent her whole life looking at my life from the outside and believing that if she could just be on the inside of it, something would finally be right. That she had never thought clearly about what being on the inside would cost. She said, I know you probably won't write back, and I understand that. But I needed to say, out loud, in writing, that what I wanted was never to hurt you. What I wanted was something else, and I went about getting it in a way that hurt you, and I am not sure those two things are as different as I wish they were. I read the letter twice. Then I put it in the small box where I keep things I am not ready to decide about. I haven't written back yet. I don't know if I will. What I think about, when I think about that letter, is a particular memory I have of us at maybe 7 years old. We were in our shared bedroom on a winter afternoon, and it was gray outside, and we were playing a game that involved most of my stuffed animals, and some of hers, and a complicated rule system that we had invented together, and that we were the only two people in the world who understood. We played for hours. When our mother called us for dinner, we didn't want to stop. We sat at the table still talking about the game, still inside it, and our mother laughed and said, "You two have your own whole world in there." We did have our own whole world. For a while, I don't know if there's a path back to anything. I don't know if there should be. I know that my sister is a real person, not a character, and that real people are more than the worst things they do, and that I am allowed to believe both of those things without knowing yet what to do with them. That's the honest answer. The uncertain middle, which is where most things that actually matter tend to live. If this story reached you, if it scared you, or moved you, or made you think of someone you should call, leave a comment. I read everything. If you're going through something that feels impossible to tell anyone, tell someone. Tell a friend, a neighbor, a stranger. The telling is how it comes into the light. Subscribe to Closest Enemies if you want more stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And take care of yourselves. This was Closest Enemies. I'll see you next time.